Now, the final and probably the most salient of all Excel functions that we're going to have a look at is the VLOOKUP function. Now, let's look at the problem that we have in front of us right now. So previously, we just worked on the inventory to get the name of items in a particular store, and then we had the total number of items. We calculated the total number of items in the store. So this is basically an excerpt from that data. So we have a data set like this, and then this data was also given to us by another data officer, and what he gave us was the date. So basically, this data set here that you can see on the left is the items and the quantity that was removed, and the date the quantity of items was removed. Now we notice that the data officer gave us this data set but did not give us the names of the items. Rather, he only used the IDs, as that was a lot easier for him to be able to just enter. He just had to just type the IDs of that item. But now we want to we want to fetch the names of these items and then just populate them in this particular column, because we don't want to have to reference the items with their IDs. It's going to be a lot difficult to read. But then we already have a table here that carries the IDs and the corresponding name of those items. Right now we're looking at a pretty small data set, so it's fairly plausible to say we could just check for the ID manually and just copy it and paste it, like 153 surgical gloves and the rest. However, this is the kind of scenario for which VLOOKUP was birthed in Microsoft Excel. With VLOOKUP, which means vertical lookup, we can cross-reference the ID field that we have here with the ID field that we have on this other data range, and select data on the same row and populate it here. Let's see what that looks like. So essentially, VLOOKUP has 4 main parameters, and to write it, we start by, since VLOOKUP is a formula, we double click where we want the output of a formula to be, which in this case is the item name on column D. We double click the cell there and type equal to, which is telling Excel that we want to impute a formula, and then we type VLOOKUP, and then we open our parentheses. So I mentioned that VLOOKUP has 4 main parameters. The very first parameter being the lookup value. Lookup value basically is the ID we are trying to reference. That's the value we are trying to cross-reference with the second data set that we are looking at, which in this case is the ID. That is the common denominator between both data sets. And so the ID is on B2. So we use B2. Now it's important to note that this particular referencing type is referred to as a relative referencing. So we're going to talk about that briefly as we go along. So I put in my comma. The next parameter that VLOOKUP requires is the table that we are going to be looking for that ID in. In this case, we have to select the entire data range here, excluding the title. So we can just, instead of typing the data range, you can either type data range by specifying J5 down to L11, or you can click here and just select the data range. However, there is something I'm going to specify here. So we're not just going to leave this way. We are going to add $sign on each of the column and row labels. The reason we are adding a $sign on the column and row labels, so it becomes $J, $5, $L, and $11. The reason we are doing this is because we are using an absolute referencing for this. So in Excel, we have relative referencing, which is what we're doing here, and absolute referencing, which is what we're doing here. The difference between both of them is during an autofill, relative reference value is going to change as you change columns or as you change rows, which means if we autofill this value downwards across rows, B2 would no longer be B2 when it gets to row 4. It becomes B4. When it gets to row 5, it becomes B5. However, with absolute referencing, whenever we autofill, or duplicate this formula across columns or across rows, J5 would remain J5 and L11 remain L11. We do this to ensure that the table that VLOOKUP is trying to reference does not change, so it remains fixed. So we don't want Excel picking the data that we need for this particular lookup from any other place other than this data set. So we use the $ to ensure that we are using an absolute referencing and that will not change when we autofill our function. We proceed with the next parameter. The next parameter that we specify with VLOOKUP is where VLOOKUP should find the data that we are looking for. So where should VLOOKUP find the item name? So the first one was, what is the ID? What is the relationship between both tables? In this case, is the ID. So we need VLOOKUP to look for this ID in this table, right, that was specified here. And when it finds that ID, it should take out the item name. And in this case, the item name is, as you can see here, the item name is on column 2. So VLOOKUP basically, for any range that you select as the table array in the second parameter, it just numbers the column from 1 to the end. So in this case, we have column 1, column 2, and column 3. So VLOOKUP would expect the name to be in column 1. So we're just going to type 1 there. So we are basically telling VLOOKUP, go to this table, look for this ID, which in this case right now is 153 on B2, and then select whatever is in column 1, which in this case is the name here, surgical gloves. And then the last parameter for VLOOKUP is a Boolean value, a true or false value. If we leave it as false, we are basically telling VLOOKUP to perform an exact match, which means if VLOOKUP does not find the ID that we are looking for on the table that we've specified, it's going to throw an error. However, if we set it to true, we'll be telling VLOOKUP to use an approximate match, which means if VLOOKUP does not find the value, it would use the closest value to the one we specified. So in this case, we'll just leave it as false because we don't want a product ID, assuming the name of, another product that we are not interested in. So we'll just leave that as false. And then that completes the parameter definition for VLOOKUP function, and we'll just press enter. I think we made a mistake there. So I typed 1 instead of 2. So I said VLOOKUP names the column, that labels the column 1, 2, 3. So the item name is on column 2, not column 1. So I'll switch that to 2, and then when I press enter, you can see now that the item name has now been populated as what? Surgical gloves. So let's look up here at the formula bar, and I'll just go over what VLOOKUP is doing one more time. So the equal to specifies a function in Excel. This VLOOKUP is the function name, and then we put in the parentheses to start the parameter definition. The very first thing we specify here is the ID, or the value that we want to look up, right, on the other table. In this case, we want to look up the ID value, and then we specify the table, right, that we want to go and look up that value on. In this case, that table is that's the range of values that we selected here. Then the next thing is we specify the column in which we want to extract information after finding that particular entry. So in this case, once it finds 153, we want it to extract column 2, extract the data from column 2, which is the name column, and then we specify false to tell VLOOKUP that it should perform an exact match. So once we've done that, that is what brings out the result here. So we can simply perform an autofill by clicking the bottom right corner of this cell and dragging, so we have that function or that formula duplicated across, all our entries here. And immediately that happens, you can notice here that 155 has been populated as surgical blades. As we can see here, 155 is surgical blades. But then we notice that 154, 154 are all showing as NA, NA. This is because if we look at the table that we defined here, there is no 154 in the data set that we have here. So what do we do if we don't want Excel to show these errors, right? But we still want Excel to perform a direct match. What we do is we wrap our VLOOKUP function in an if error function. Now the if error function basically tells VLOOKUP that if there is an error while trying to retrieve the value, so an error like this where we cannot find the ID or the VLOOKUP value that we're trying to locate in the other table, if such error occurs, right, we can supply an alternate value, right? So an alternative value to be displayed. So in this case, what we're going to do is I'm just going to modify the formula here on the formula bar a bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to write the if error function. So we write if error and open our parentheses. The parameters for if error basically are just two parameters. The first parameter is the value, which in this case is whatever is returned from our VLOOKUP function. And then we put a comma and then specify the fallback value. So what happens if the VLOOKUP function encounters an error? So if the VLOOKUP function encounters an error, we can write a simple string of text by putting a double quotes. That's how we specify a string of text to Excel, and we'll just write something like not specified, or we can just say something like no item name, and then we close the parentheses. So I'm just going to run through this again. We've already talked about the VLOOKUP function, and this entire function that I've just highlighted is what is going to output the results from looking up the ID value on the second table to bring out the item name. Now, in case there is an error, the if error function would catch this error and then return this value instead of showing this weird value that we have here. And then we'll just write that and then click enter. So we will just duplicate, autofill this function, the updated function, across our entire column. Once we've done that, you can see now that we no longer have that error. We just simply have no item name anywhere we come across an error. All right, and with that being said, that's a wrap for the data analytics course. Thank you and bye now.